Hello everybody, welcome to Movies by McManus, the channel where we break down movies, comics, TV, books, whatever kind of media you're into, in the context of who created it and what effect it's trying to have on the world. And today we're going to be breaking down the 2016 book, The President Street Boys, Growing Up Mafia, by Frank DiMatteo. Now, if you've been following this channel, you know that I'm fascinated by Mafia history and the history of organized crime in America. So, I wanted to break down this book specifically because if you're somebody who's interested in organized crime and want to know more about the history of the Mafia in America, this book is really the place to start. It's not nearly the best book on the Mafia, but this book and Frank DiMatteo's books in general can give you a baseline introduction into how the Mafia works and what a day in the life of one of these gangsters was really like. One of the reasons for this is that Frank DiMatteo himself was a Mafia associate for many years. But since he was never that far up the hierarchy and never cut a deal with law enforcement, he doesn't have the need to make himself look better than he really was. For example, most books on the Mafia are written by either former law enforcement or by journalists going off the word of gangsters turned informant. This is a problem for two reasons. One, a story written from the point of view of law enforcement has a built-in motivation to make the gangsters look as bad as possible. And a story written from the point of view of an informant has the motivation to make the informant look as good as possible. And secondly, a lot of these books feel the need to put things into historical context, making the book feel more like factual text than an actual story. Frank DiMatteo's books are a bit different. Since he was a Mafia associate, but not that far up the ladder, he doesn't feel the need to shy away from more serious crimes, since he wouldn't have been a part of any. And secondly, DiMatteo makes no effort to be factual in his books. He makes it very clear from the beginning that these are stories from the streets, that the police and the journalists may be saying things happened one way, but here's how people on the street told it. With this, he makes the mobsters feel like mythic figures and urban legends, which is important when understanding the culture of the Mafia that surrounded Frank's neighborhood when he was growing up. Now, there is an obvious problem here, that things in this book might not be historically accurate. But DiMatteo makes it clear that historical accuracy is not what he's going for, but instead describing the culture of the Mafia that once existed in this country. Anyone who knows basic mob history has probably heard the name Crazy Joe Gallo before. He was portrayed by Sebastian Maniscalco in The Irishman, and became famous by rebelling against the hierarchy of the New York Mafia. Gallo firmly believed that the standards and rules that the New York Mafia held themselves to were absolutely ridiculous, and that gangsters should be allowed to do whatever they wanted. One of the rules of the Mafia at that time was that you could only have Italian members in your crew. But to Gallo, as long as you were good at stealing, you were in. He had Greek, Arab, Jewish, and black members in his crew. Turning away somebody who was a great thief just because they weren't Italian was ridiculous to the Gallo brothers. Not only were they going to let whoever they wanted into their crew, but they were also going to let their crew commit whatever crimes they wanted, including drug dealing, which was always banned by the hierarchy of the New York Mafia. This led Joe Gallo and his brothers to go to war with their family's boss, Joe Colombo, and create their own family, the Gallo family, in defiance of the New York Mafia's five-family rule. In 1971, during a rally of the Italian American Civil Rights League in Columbus Circle, Joe Gallo is shot in the head by an assassin, Jerome Johnson. And since Johnson was a black man, not Italian, everybody in the mob naturally assumed that Joe Gallo was behind the hit. Now, according to the official investigation by the NYPD, Jerome Johnson was in fact a lone gunman, and they came to the conclusion that neither Joey Gallo or any other members of the New York Mafia had anything to do with the murder. Now, Frank DiMatteo actually tells the story a bit differently, saying that the bosses of the New York mob wanted Joe Colombo dead and used Jerome Johnson, a black man, as the shooter, knowing that it would naturally look like Joey Gallo was behind it. Either way, it doesn't matter. Like I said, this is about the stories on the street, not about historical accuracy. Whether Joe Gallo was behind the murder of Joe Colombo or not, the point is everyone thought he was behind it. And less than a year later, Joe Gallo was assassinated himself, in front of his family while celebrating his 43rd birthday at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. And this brings us to Frank DiMatteo. Frank grew up around Joe Gallo and his brothers, and his father was even a hitman for the President Street crew. And the story of Joey Gallo is very much told from Frank's perspective. From when he was an early child and into his teens, Frank tells about how his everyday was dominated by these larger-than-life characters, and how they very much shaped his worldview. Growing up around gangsters, and particularly these gangsters, Frank understood from a very young age that the Mafia's persona, that they were gentlemen gangsters, and that even though they were criminals, they still followed a code, was the furthest thing from the truth. The bosses of the New York Mafia were nothing but hypocrites, who broke their own rules while punishing others who did the same. This came to Frank personally. During the Gallo-Colombo War, Frank and other neighborhood kids were used as couriers, since one of the mob's rules was that they would never harm children. But then one day, some members of the Colombo family opened fire on Frank and some of the other neighborhood kids, proving to Frank from a young age that the higher-ups of the mob don't really care about any sort of morality, and never intended on playing by their own rules. Not only were the Gallos sticking it to the government by being gangsters, but they were also sticking it to the hierarchy of the New York Mafia by openly defying their orders. After all, the whole reason they became gangsters was because they didn't want someone telling them what to do. And one of the great things about this book is that it perfectly captures that culture of the Mafia, and shows you really why someone like Frank would want to join this gang. But since the Mafia had become so powerful, it became a part of everyday life for Italian Americans, and was no longer seen as a necessary evil to lift Italians out of poverty, but instead as a legitimate career path. According to Frank, he never really considered what the Gallo gang was doing to be wrong. Stealing was just a way of life for them, and was a normal part of who they were. And that's a part of mob life that a lot of these by-the-facts Mafia books miss. When asking why someone would want to join the Mafia, it's because when something is so ingrained into your culture and identity, it's usually not seen as being wrong. But in the end, Joey Gallo's younger brother Albert turned out not to be as crazy as he was. And when he took over the gang, he didn't want to cause any more trouble with the New York bosses and submitted to them. Albert agreed to follow the boss's orders, and Frank DiMatteo and his father were given the choice of either be exiled by the gang or be killed, after the New York bosses found out that they had been selling drugs. As for the rest of the President Street crew, it was the city of New York which got rid of them, rather than the New York Mafia bosses. by building a new pipeline and redirecting the city's sewage to President Street, and then condemning all the buildings in the area. Not only did this force the President Street crew to shut down their bars and hangouts, but also destroyed the entire neighborhood, and led to the eviction of several New York Italians who never had anything to do with the Mafia to begin with. Eventually, Frank DiMatteo and his father joined the DeCavalcante family in New Jersey, which leads to Frank's most recent book, Were We Ever Really Cowboys?, and is a story for another time. So there you have it. It's the story of these larger-than-life characters who once walked the earth and are now gone from it. If you have anything you'd like to share about the Mafia, about Frank DiMatteo and his book, feel free to leave a comment below. And if you like this video, subscribe to our channel, check out our podcast, or follow us on social media at Movies by McManus. I'm your host, Greg, and have a good night.